Well, good evening, all of you. I'm so glad to see all of you enjoying yourself underneath the wings here of Air Force One. And welcome to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. My name is Anthony Eames, and I'm the Director of Scholarly Initiatives for the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. This is a proud night for many of us at the Foundation and Institute. It marks the beginning of our first major effort, our first major convening dedicated to all of you, dedicated to supporting the broader academic and scholarly community. I want to emphasize that this is a beginning. We do not see this Age of Reagan Conference as a one-off event. We see this as a big step forward to sustaining and reinvigorating scholarship on the 40th president. I mean, if anyone's watched Stranger Things or Top Gun, you know that the 80s are back. So this is just one more way that the 80s are back. We've had some truly outstanding partners in this initiative. And when I mention your name, please just raise your hand. First, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the Pepperdine School of Public Policy, N.P. Peterson. The Clements Center for National Security at University of Texas, Austin. Will Inboden will be here tomorrow, he. The America in the World Consortium. Drayton, I think you should raise your hand for this one. The Woodrow Wilson Center, Christian, and the Dobb family. This conference would not be possible without your support and your thought leadership. I should also give a note of thanks to our colleagues at the National Archives. They have been working overtime. And that's to make sure that all of you can write the next draft of history. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the staff that have made this all possible. I'm going to embarrass them by name, so just bear with me. To the director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C., Roger Zackheim. He has been instrumental in every stage of planning and execution for this conference, and he's made the very foolish mistake of writing a book. So if he comes around to pick your brain, just have some sympathy for him, okay? To Dave Trulio, our president and CEO. He invests in scholarship that matters, and that's an investment that we hope to continue. To Meredith Stasa, Kim Lapina, Ryan Haddad, Anthony Zona, Thomas Kenna, Michael Stanton. The list goes on and on. Taylor, I don't forget Taylor. Please give them a round of thanks. And of course to our steering committee, and I want to point out one person in particular, Henry Now, who has been a consistent source of energy and ideas over the years. Okay, so turning back to Ronald Reagan. When he dedicated the grounds of this library in 1991, his wish was to make this a dynamic forum where scholars interpret the past. And of course, since 1991, the way we study history has changed quite a bit. Historians now more than ever, of course, embrace cultural and social and environmental factors, listening to the voice of those dispossessed of power, rather than tracking the every word of the man in the most powerful office in the world. Political scientists have adjusted their lens to focus on the presidency as an institution, seizing on more and more data and ever more sophisticated quantitative methods. And the onset of the information age has given our friends in rhetoric and communication studies ever more subjects for study, meaning that the president's ability to reach millions of Americans and an international audience is no longer so unique. So These are all positive developments, but they make my job a little more difficult. Given all of these developments, how does a presidential foundation and institute that is dedicated to the life and legacy of President Reagan interact with the scholarly community, given all these changes in the way we study history? Well, I'm taking the easy road out, and we've brought all of you here to help answer that question. And so please don't be shy. If you have an idea, share it with us. Share it with us often, please. So enough from me. To get us started, I'm going to welcome Professor Steve Hayward and Professor Beth Fisher. You might know them from their work. Professor Fisher jump-started the study of Reagan back in 1993 with her very influential book, The Reagan Reversal. 15 years later, Professor Steve Hayward authored his 2-volume study, The Age of Reagan, which has become required reading for all of us who do anything related to the 40th president. And they've done quite a bit more ever since. Professor Fisher is at the Wordsworth College at University of Toronto, where she specializes in international security, crime, and U.S. foreign policy. Her most recent book, published by University of Kentucky Press, The Myth of Triumphalism, Rethinking Ronald Reagan's Cold War Legacy. She has published numerous articles on conflict management, intelligence analysis, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and much, much more. And she's been awarded the prestigious Nobel Fellowship for her research on the ending of the Cold War and its impact on contemporary affairs. Now on to Professor Hayward. He's a resident scholar at UC Berkeley's Institute of Government Studies and a fellow of Public Law and Public Policy program at Berkeley Law. He's also currently the Gaylord Distinguished Visiting Professor at Pepperdine University's School of Public Policy and was the inaugural visiting scholar in conservative thought and policy at University of Colorado Boulder. From 2002 to 2012, he was the Weyerhaus Fellow in Law and Economics at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. And in addition to his two-volume Age of Reagan study, it's both a good read and a doorstop. He's authored 9 other books, the most recent of which is M. Stanton Evans, Conservative Wit and Apostle of Freedom. So please join me in welcoming Professor Hayward and Professor Fisher to the stage for our keynote conversation.
I think they're going to move the monolith out of the way.
Yeah.
I thought, well, I'll just say, we flipped a coin. She's going first.
Yeah.
As soon as they get the monolith out of the way.
Right. Randall Fowler in our first session reminded us that Taylor Swift is performing down the street. So we've got a lot of competition. We have to really be on our game tonight, Steve.
Yeah, and of course what that means is that the combined audience and combined revenues for the 2 events, I mean, we each equal out about $100 million. So
right.
I'll take that.
Exactly.
That'll work.
Exactly.
Right.
But thank you to the Reagan Foundation and Institute for inviting us here today. Thank you, Anthony, and all of the team for putting in the hours and hours of effort that went into this conference. It's you folks get to talk Reagan all the time, 24/7, but for folks like me and other researchers, this is a real nerd fest, really, but we love it.
Right.
You know, we're academics who love to talk about Ronald Reagan, so having an opportunity like this is terrific. So thank you to everyone at the Reagan Institute.
Right.
Okay, so Steve, the title of this conference is The Age of Reagan, which happens to be the title of your now classic books, right? The first one came out in 2009. And these books are a big picture account of the years, well, 1964 to 1980, before Ronald Reagan became president. And One of the many things that I love about this book is that you did a great job in recreating what it felt like to live through those years, what an era felt like. And that's a really difficult thing to do. It's pretty straightforward to tell a chronology of events, but to recapture what it felt like is much more difficult. So I'm wondering, what prompted you to write The Age of Reagan, and what do you mean by the concept Age of Reagan?
Right, yeah, a fit of madness, maybe. Well, I was self-consciously imitating the literary model of the great Arthur Schlesinger, his, 3 or 4 volumes on the age of Roosevelt. Delightful reading. He was a great stylist. I disagree with him in certain respects, especially the first volume about the crisis of the old order. So I was really aping his approach and trying to return the favor, so to speak. I think Sean Lentz had the same thing in mind, the same model with his Age of Reagan. His covers a longer time frame, is doing it somewhat different than what I was doing, but you can see that this idea, well, we know this. Historians like to have ages of American history. So, the founding era, pre-Civil War, Reconstruction, Gilded Age, Progressive Era, New Deal era, and then it starts to get a little curious. When does the New Deal era end? When does the Age of Reagan begin? And then, of course, the back-end question there is, Sean Lentz thought the Age of Reagan ended in 2008, but that was my idea. I was just trying to emulate. I'll add two more quick thoughts. One is I tend to think most biographies don't do a very good job of putting people in a wider context. So, my models for a biography, my favorite Lincoln biography is still Lord Charnwood from 100 years ago. Winston Churchill's 4 volumes about the Marlborough was called Marlborough, His Life and Times. And in those books, the main figures often disappear for 20 or 30 pages while you're getting important circumstances that the person had to match up to. A modern example I think is really great is, I think it's volume 3 of Caro's biography of Lyndon Johnson, Master of the Senate. And I think you cite it in one of your books.
Yeah.
And if you know that book, which I highly recommend, the first 120 pages are a history of the Senate from the very beginning up through all the change of the 20th century. And that's necessary and useful. It could be its own separate book, by the way. It's necessary and useful because then you're able to appreciate Johnson's mastery of that otherwise miserable job of majority leader all the more. And so those are the kind of thoughts I have in mind of trying a book like that.
Right. And so do you think the Age of Reagan is over?
Yes. So, there's arguments about when did the New Deal end? Does it end with Nixon? Certainly with the arrival of Reagan. Mm-hmm. And these things got messy in modern times, and historians like to do revisionism, like you.
Yeah.
We'll come to that. Obama wanted to be the un-Reagan, not so much anti-Reagan. He talked about Reagan in some interesting and respectful ways, but clearly disagreed with his ideology. And so you could do that, although do remember, just as a political phenomenon, that the Obama years were great for Obama and terrible for the Democratic Party. They lost 1,000 seats net in state legislatures, lost control of Congress. So there was still the tug of war going on in sort of partisan terms between the two parties. My view, which may well be controversial, is the Age of Reagan ends for certain with the arrival of Donald Trump. Even though it's the same party, he's so very different from Reagan, not only temperamentally as you can think of, but also in a lot of ideas, right? Trump hated NAFTA. That was really Ronald Reagan's idea. Trump said he wouldn't mess with entitlements. Reagan didn't go after hard about entitlements, but talked about the problem and had a couple of fits and starts over it. And one thing I notice is, here just an editorial comment, a lot of younger people I notice these days, they don't know anything about Reagan, really. And a lot of the ones who love Trump are openly contemptuous of Reagan, and this bothers me a lot. They said, we don't want any zombie Reaganism, and it's on 2 levels. It's style. He wasn't mean enough to the left. Like, okay. And then also they don't like Reagan's neoliberalism. I actually hear live human beings, bipeds that walk among us, saying this term from the left applied to Ronald Reagan. And so they're contemptuous of the ideas that we associate with Reagan. And I'm thinking, this is a strange world that I never saw this on my bingo card.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, it's interesting that you say that you find Obama being the un-Reagan, because I think in terms of style and rhetoric, there are some parallels, right? The Ronald Reagan, Morning Again in America, and Obama, Hope
and Change, right?
They were both great communicators, great public speakers, great writers. Their policy ideas differed, but I think stylistically there are some similarities there.
I think and remember that Obama was in college during the Reagan years, so that's when he's really forming his ideas and learning about figuring out where it's going, and so it was front and center for all that, right?
Right.
And I'll just say one more thing. If you read Obama's books, now partly this was politics, it was a way of jabbing Hillary Clinton, but one of his criticisms of Bill Clinton was, you were this very talented man and you didn't do enough to contest the Reagan legacy. Because the Age of Reagan, Richard Reeves, who never cared for Reagan, but in his book on Reagan said what happened was Bill Clinton finally gave up and joined the Reagan Revolution. That's the way he put it.
So do you want to talk a little bit about how our image of Reagan has changed over time?
Yeah, so this would be actually a good segue into turning the tables and me asking you some questions. Let me give you one. I'll put it this way. Let me turn it this way that I think I told you this 15 years ago, the first time we met. If I only saw the titles of your book, I would say, I'm not going to like these books very well. Yeah. And then I read them and decided I liked them very much. Quibbles, sure, but that's boring. The final chapter of my second volume on Reagan, the chapter title was The Reagan Revolution and Its Discontents. I could have called it The Myth of the Reagan Revolution. So we should work with this a little bit here. And give you sort of one example, a very specific example, but I think it's very illustrative of where we are today and looking back at the Reagan years with a new perspective. If you follow, as most of you probably do to one degree or another, one of the big causes these days of conservatives in America is trying to roll back, as it's called, the administrative state. It's a very clunky title. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to go into any of the details of that because it's a long story. It deserves a book at least the size of one of yours or longer. And one of the key pillars of the administrative state is a thing called the Chevron Doctrine. And it's a live issue at the Supreme Court right now. Some recent decisions have chipped away at it. People say we're going to completely change that. Here's what everybody forgets. I love asking young lawyers in the Federal Society if they know that the Chevron case was a case in 1984 that gave us the doctrine, and it was a case the Reagan administration won. It was a Reagan victory that gave us the doctrine that then unfolds into, like I say, it's a big story. And so now everyone says, wait a minute, a lot of people, younger lawyers, they don't know this. Okay, wait a minute, what? How did that happen? And to make a long story short, fast forward to, I think, about 2002 or 2003, very long, 150-page article in the Harvard Law Review by the then dean of the Harvard Law School, Elena Kagan. Mm-hmm. And she said, all these people, a very good article, by the way, I highly recommend it. I forget the title, I can find it. She said, everybody likes to blame the administrative state on Woodrow Wilson and the New Deal and Lyndon Johnson, but you know what, if you look really closely, the very things that upset people today really crystallized and accelerated in the Reagan administration. Mm-hmm. In other words, I could say Elena Kagan was the Beth Fisher of the administrative state question. Not quite right, but... and so it took a long time for people to figure this out. And as I say, most people don't know this, but now people are scratching their heads saying, well, we've got to rethink a lot of things. And that's one reason why that's a big muddle. But it's just one specific example that I think is very interesting about how things that look one way at one moment can flip around the other way with the passage of time.
Absolutely. I think our understanding of Ronald Reagan has changed tremendously over time. I started researching the Reagan administration in the early 1990s, primarily because I was interested in the ending of the Cold War. I'm a political scientist. My specialty is international security. And so I was very interested in how and why the Cold War ended, full stop, and ended peacefully. Because if you go back to the 1970s and the 1980s, no one was talking about the ending of the Cold War. It was a global conflict that had gone on for 40 years. It was considered to be a fundamental part of the global system. No one was predicting the ending of the Cold War. So the fact that it ended, and that it ended peacefully, is something that I thought really needed to be studied, because if we can understand how that conflict was resolved peacefully, maybe we'll learn something about how to resolve India, Pakistan, or North Korea, South Korea, or the Middle East. So that was the lens through which I came to start studying Ronald Reagan. And in the early 1990s, the image of Ronald Reagan was that the president was kind of an intellectual lightweight, not terribly interested in policy making, really not interested in foreign policy. And, you know, the other members of the administration crafted the policy, and President Reagan was just the spokesperson. And in Will and Bowden's new book, The Peacemakers, I think the phrase he uses is, Reagan was viewed as a simple-minded warmonger. And I think that captures the image pretty well. So in the view, the popular view in the 1990s, the Cold War ended because of Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev came to power in March of 1985. He revolutionized the Soviet Union. He revolutionized Soviet foreign policy and military policy, and voila, the Cold War ended, and Ronald Reagan just happened to be the guy sitting in the Oval Office at the time all of this happened, right? So that was the prevailing view when I came to this field. If you fast forward to June 2004 and President Reagan's funeral, the image of the president couldn't have been more different. Now the image of the president was as this strong chief executive, the man who had forced the Soviet Union to collapse, the man who enabled the West to triumph over communism. It was 180 degrees from where it had been in the early 1990s. And also the interesting thing was that Mikhail Gorbachev had largely been written out of the story at that point. And if he was in the story, it was Mikhail Gorbachev caved to American pressure, right? That was it. So it was a stunning turnaround in the public image of Ronald Reagan. And this triumphalist image, this idea that he forced the collapse of the Soviet Union and enabled democracy to triumph over communism, that's the one that's kind of taken hold of the popular imagination.
Right.
And both of them, can I just say, both of those characterizations are extreme, and both of them are erroneous in their own special way.
Well, I want to see if we can reach an equilibrium.
Sure.
I think we can. I mean, I refer to that theory as that slogan as the Rush Limbaugh version is Reagan single-handedly defeated the Soviet Union with one hand tied behind its back. All right, that's the fun version. But there was Margaret Thatcher who said sometime in the early 90s that Ronald Reagan won the Cold War without the firing of a single shot. That's a pretty bold statement that sounds triumphalist, right? I do, by the way, wonder, and I always thought to try and get a query before because I didn't know her, I didn't know people around her, but I wanted to ask about that statement because I think she might have been self-consciously, in the back of her mind, referencing Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. And in that case, it would take on a slightly different coloration. But let me give you the more serious case for why we got to triumphalism. You already mentioned one of the two key elements, I think. One of them is there was, maybe you know the story, John Lewis Gaddis in one of his books tells the story of being at some conference of, the experts, and I think around 1986, and saying, things are changing, this new leader, maybe we should start thinking about a post-Cold War world. He said everybody looked at him like he was from Mars. And you just said the point, but to repeat it, there was nobody, with one or two curious exceptions, nobody, including Reagan, including virtually everybody around him, who thought the Cold War would end quickly, certainly not in 10, 11 years. Reagan said the night after the Berlin Wall came down, I never thought it would happen this fast. The most optimistic people thought maybe in 20 years they're just going to run out of gas. But even that was vague and sort of, okay. So there's a huge failure of expert judgment here, right? And so the idea that there's a premeditated plan, we're going to, here's the plan. On the other hand, we do know, after Reagan leaves office, you heard that he had told Richard Allen in the late 70s, 78, 79, my theory of the Cold War is we win and they lose. What do you think of that? Now, if you just go with that, say, well, that's kind of what happened. It looks like he did beat him with one hand, not one hand tied, but okay. I wonder about that statement a little bit. Not necessarily its authenticity, because it came out late. And I know Richard Allen, and he's not going to tell me if it was embellished. But, and this starts to get into your territory, and I'll make this quick. There's another simple statement Reagan made, and we talked about it on one of the panels this afternoon. It was about the Panama Canal a couple years earlier, and starting the '76 campaign. The Panama Canal, we built it, we paid for it, it's ours, we're keeping it. Big cheers from the crowd. It turns out if you read some of the longer articles Reagan wrote at the time, one for Orbis, some other columns, one of his radio addresses, he wasn't unalterably opposed to letting Panama have final sovereignty over the canal. He thought the treaties were defective for some very specific reasons. Didn't safeguard American, we ought to have some residual right to run the canal in the event of war. We should have priority in the canal for our warships in time of war. He also said, this government's no good, Torrijos is too pro-Castro. But the point is, his full view of it was not sort of black and white, Manichaean. There's a lot more openness to it. I think he also caught the mood of the country, which is after Vietnam and all the rest. It's another place where we thought we were losing, right? So then you come to the Cold War, and this is where I think you really get after it well, is Reagan could have that view of the Soviet Union as the evil empire, and at the same time, in what might look like cognitive dissonance, but we have to make peace with these people, and there ought to be a way to do it. And his aides, as you know, they thought he was simplistic when he said, I'd just love to get a Soviet leader in a room together and we could talk this thing through. People thought he was being naive, right? And that's kind of how it finally happened.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to unpack there, Steve.
Yeah, sorry. I'm sorry, but I went on too.
No, I'm trying to think. Okay, where to start? Yeah, the thing about Ronald Reagan, and I'm constantly learning, right? So I wrote the Reagan Reversal largely in 1993. 1994.
Oh, okay.
So it was written a while ago when we didn't really have access to government documents. There were very few oral history conferences at that part. It was meant to be. Thank you for.
Well, I'm going to have you sign it, of course. This edition says 1997, but
yes, that's when it was published. But
okay.
it took a long time to get out.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, University Press. Say no more.
Yeah. Right. Exactly.
Right. Those. Oh, that's right.
I would have brought your book, but they're both too heavy.
I know.
I could only bring one carry-on.
I've tried to get the TSA to adopt them as self-defense weapons on all domestic flights, and I get nowhere with this. But
so the Reagan Reversal, I largely wrote it in '93, maybe a little bit into '94, when there was very limited documents. It was meant to be a first stab at trying to understand President Reagan's Soviet policy. And at that time, I had this puzzle. We had, in 1983, President Reagan is talking about evil empire. In '82, he had said, freedom and democracy will leave communism on the ash heap of history. And then you get to 1984, and he starts giving speeches, and he calls for cooperation, and we need understanding, and we need dialogue, and I'm ready to meet with my Soviet counterparts anywhere, anytime, and saying things like, we do not threaten the Soviet Union. And so to me, that was just odd. It didn't seem to fit with what had come before it. So my puzzle at that point in time was, what's with this speech? Why the outreach? And the other thing that was puzzling about it was this came before Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. It was maybe 15, 18 months before Gorbachev came to power and before there were any reforms in the Soviet Union. So it really, to me, was a puzzle. What's going on with this speech? So that's where the Reagan Reversal came from. We now have way more documents, thanks to a lot of the archivists here and a lot of the oral history conferences. So we have a much better understanding of the larger context of what was going on behind the scenes in the Reagan administration. And we now understand that President Reagan came to office with kind of a two-step strategy. First, you build up U.S. military capacity, and then second, you leverage that military capacity to force the Soviet Union to come to the negotiating table to negotiate arms reductions. It sounds counterintuitive, but the arms buildup was meant to bring about a reduction in arsenals. That was peace through strength. Now, what the Reagan administration didn't know at the time, they couldn't know at the time, that the Soviets already wanted to end the arms race. They already wanted to reduce their arsenals. They didn't need to be cajoled. They didn't need to be threatened. They had done studies in 1968. The Defense Ministry had done studies about what if we use our nuclear weapons in Europe? What does that look like? Short answer, catastrophe for the Soviet Union. It would have been disastrous for the Soviet Union. I think we just lost my
There we
mic.
go. You're back.
And I'm back. So 1968, they did studies on how would it play out if the Soviet Union actually used its nuclear weapons, and they said it would be catastrophic for the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. In the 1970s, they did more studies. Let's imagine that we have a successful nuclear attack on on NATO airfields in Western Europe. Let's play that out and see what that looks like. Again, it looks like catastrophe for the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact allies. And when Brezhnev got those reports, he was really shaken. And what they did was they highly classified those studies so that they wouldn't circulate. So that information never really percolated down the chain of command. And then in 1981, the Defense Ministry, the General Staff did yet another study and came to the same conclusion, that it would be catastrophic for the Soviet Union to use its nuclear weapons. So by the 1970s, the early 1970s, the Soviet Union had determined that its nuclear arsenal had no military utility. It was useless. They weren't going to use them. They had no plans for a prolonged nuclear war. So just let me follow up.
Sure, no, sorry.
But the Reagan administration, of course, didn't know that.
Right.
So then what we also now know from more documents and great work by Paul Leto and Simon Miles and others is that President Reagan had some pretty radical ideas about U.S. security. And I use the word radical because I'm not really sure what other word to use. So for example, he wanted to abolish nuclear weapons. Really radical idea at the time. He wanted to build a defensive...
Most Americans didn't believe him. What do you think the Soviets thought?
Right,
Okay,
right. Well,
sorry.
The Soviets had such a hard time figuring out what he meant. So he wanted to eliminate nuclear weapons. He wanted to build a defensive system that would protect American citizens from a nuclear attack, right? The Strategic Defense Initiative, another radical idea. And then he wanted to share SDI technology with the Soviet Union. Three really radical ideas, very visionary ideas. He was really thinking about, let's move the United States to a new security era. And the other thing that I've learned while doing more research is that he had no support within his own administration, or virtually no support within the administration for all of these ideas. Nobody thought getting rid of nuclear weapons was a good idea. Very few people supported SDI. Caspar Weinberger a bit, and no one thought sharing SDI with the Soviet Union was a good idea. Like Caspar Weinberger, who was probably the biggest supporter of SDI next to Reagan, said, Mr. President, like the SDI thing, I can get behind that, but when you talk about sharing SDI, it scares the pants off me. So his administration was constantly trying to talk him out of those ideas, and he'd write letters to Gorbachev and say, we'll share SDI, and then members of the administration would cross that out, and they'd send him a new draft, and he'd put it back in, and they'd cross it out. And Ambassador Jack Matlock has a funny story where they were going through a situation like this where they kept crossing out the paragraphs about we'll share SDI with you, and President Reagan called him into the office, and he said, Jack, whose letter is this?
Right.
And Jack Matlock said, it's your letter, Mr. President. Jack, I want to offer to share SDI. But Mr. President, everyone says we can't. Jack, I want to share SDI, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to keep it in the letter. So he kept insisting on that. And the other thing was Gorbachev didn't believe him. So every time President Reagan offered to share, and he made the offer in letters, at summit meetings, every time Gorbachev got a little irritated by it. And there was an instance at the Reykjavik summit,
I'm going to mention that one. Right.
Where President Reagan was once again saying, look, we'll share SDI, we'll have a shield, and that will protect us from your nuclear weapons, and then you have a shield, and that will protect you from our nuclear weapons, and that means that nuclear weapons will then be useless, which means they'll be obsolete, which means we can then get rid of them. So SDI was a core component of this drive to abolish nuclear weapons. But as he's saying this, Gorbachev interrupts him and says, Mr. President, you keep offering to share SDI technology, but your country will not even share dairy milking machines with us.
You won't even sell us farm equipment, right?
Yeah. So this is, and sharing SDI would constitute a revolution, and we both know revolutions don't happen all that often, so let's stick to more pragmatic matters. So Reagan was really dejected by that. And then after that, members of his administration said, you know, Mr. President, we all don't think you can share SDI technology. Gorbachev is getting irritated. He doesn't believe you. But Reagan did not give up. He said, okay, I got another idea. What if Gorbachev doesn't trust us, so what if we got around this whole trust issue by putting SDI under international control?
Ah, sort of the modern day Baruch plan in some ways.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So it wouldn't be up to us. It would be under an international agency, and then maybe that would get around the trust issue. And so just last week, actually, I was reading reports where the members of the Reagan administration kind of played that out. Okay, what would it look like if SDI were under international control, and what would it look like if every country had a button so that, you know, the shield goes up? Right? How would that play out strategically if every country had access to a defensive shields? So they were playing that out.
Yeah, I mean, I know you know this, that one of the things that so Gorbachev says, look, if we get rid of all our weapons, what do you need this thing for? It was one of the many arguments back and forth. And Reagan said, you know, this is prescience. Do remember, by the way, this gets passed over when people talk about the speech in March of '83. He did say this is a long-term project. It'll probably take 20 years to do. Well, he said to Gorbachev, well, even if we get rid of our weapons, you know, in 20 years there might be some rogue country like Libya, and we might want to be able to, both of us, defend ourselves against somebody like that. Well, here we are with North Korea and all the rest of that. So, I don't know. Let me continue on this, though, because here's where, not really an argument, but I think you say, correct me if I'm mischaracterizing this, that SDI turned out to be, for a time, an impediment to ending the Cold War. And you do blame both sides, right?
Oh, yeah.
The fundamental issue is a lack of trust. So I have a broad question, but the narrow one is, and you mentioned, as so many of our scientists said, this can't be made to work at any reasonable cost or technology. And the Soviet Union had said, we don't think they can make it work. Why were the Soviets so adamant about making it a condition for stopping things? And why was Reagan so stubborn in saying no?
Yeah, okay, great questions. So the Soviets, in 1978, the Soviets had considered building a program that was remarkably similar to SDI. And it was proposed by one of the star weapons designers. His name was Vladimir Stalemate. And they had this idea that they were going to have space shuttles and be able to shoot down incoming missiles in trajectory, but theirs was a little different. Theirs had an offensive capability, right? So that it was also going to be a nuclear, it was going to be a space-based attack capability. So they had, and the Soviets had great nuclear physicists, they had great scientists, but their engineers and their materials and their factories were not as good, but they had great weapons designers. So Stalemate had this proposal for, you know, for lack of a better word, a Soviet SDI. And they examined it and they studied it and they considered the pros and cons, and they ultimately decided not to build it for a whole bunch of strategic reasons and financial reasons and technology reasons. So when you fast forward to March of 1983 and President Reagan makes his SDI speech, well, they had a deep bench. You know, they had a lot of expertise to be able to evaluate an American plan. So in the beginning, they had a lot of respect for American scientists. So they thought, well, if anybody could do this, it's probably the Americans. So in the beginning, they were pretty concerned. But as things played out, you know, the American plan was really kind of just a loose idea for quite a while.
Right.
Which the Soviets knew. And so the Soviets kind of came to the conclusion that it's probably not going to happen in 10 or 20 years. If it does happen, we'll be able to overwhelm it. We know how to overwhelm it. Congress is probably going to cut the funding long before we ever get to that point. So the scientists and the military industrialists were saying, you know, the scientists were saying, we don't really need to be concerned about this. But the problem for Gorbachev was the Soviet military was just like our military. The Soviet military says, oh, here's a threat. well, if you give us rubles, sir, we can build projects that will counter American SDI. So Gorbachev was put in the position of his own military is asking for anti-SDI funding now, when Gorbachev just wants to end the nuclear arms race. That was their number one goal, to end the nuclear arms race and reduce arsenals. So for him, SDI was an irritant, and he wanted Reagan to drop SDI so that Gorbachev would not have the pressure from his military to give them money. Can I just make one point?
Yeah.
So Gorbachev made a strategic mistake by linking SDI to reductions in arms, nuclear arms. Essentially what Gorbachev did was he said, Mr. President, if you agree to abandon SDI, we will agree to reduce our nuclear arsenals. Well, they wanted to reduce their nuclear arsenals anyway. They were giving away the sleeves from their vest, right? And a famous George Shultz phrase. So by linking the two, what eventually happened was all of the arms reduction process got delayed because President Reagan would not give up SDI.
And why do you think Reagan was so stubborn about it? Does he really believed in it? I mean, is it that simple, or?
Well, I think so. This is my take on it, and I should say my views on SDI, on a lot of this stuff, evolve as I do more research, as I look through more documents. My feeling is Reagan saw SDI as the linchpin to being able to abolish nuclear weapons. In his view, if we could build a shield that would protect American citizens from a nuclear attack, that would render Soviet nuclear arms useless. And then if the Soviets had a similar shield, NATO weapons would also be useless, and therefore they could just they could abolish nuclear weapons. So I think that was how SDI tied into Reagan's quest to abolish nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
But can I just, I'm going to.
Sure. No, please do.
But one thing and this is, maybe somebody in the room knows the answer to this question. I don't know why, when Reagan kept offering to Gorbachev, we'll share SDI, we'll share SDI, we'll share SDI. I don't know why Gorbachev just didn't say, yeah, great idea, let's do that.
Yeah.
Because if Gorbachev had said, yeah, we'll share SDI with you, well, Congress would have killed SDI right then and there. They don't want a massive transfer of technology to the Soviet Union, and it would have accomplished Gorbachev's goal for him. So I don't know why he didn't do that.
Well, he did, of course, as you know, he did decouple it
he did.
in a few months.
That was pivotal.
I mean, I always thought that maybe this is too simple, but I'm not sure. Is he went back to his own military establishment, the Politburo, and says, well, look, I tried, he's a stubborn guy, and it's still in our interest to go forward with the larger project. I mean, I think there's some good evidence that that's how they thought. They're still very frustrated with Reagan, Yakovlev and Chernayev and some of those very interesting guys around Gorbachev. I'm fascinated with those guys. God, Reagan's driving us nuts, but we should do this, it's the right, okay. The fundamental.
Can I just add one
Sure.
more thing onto that, Steve?
Yep.
Gorbachev's advisors had been kind of hounding him, saying, just stop talking about SDI. Focus on reducing nuclear arsenals. That's what we really want to happen. Stop harping on SDI, because the more you talk about SDI, the more the Americans value SDI. So just let it go.
Right.
And it took a
Exactly.
while for Gorbachev to get to that point, but he eventually.
Well, that's right. I mean, I remember this vividly as people saying, well, gee, you see it's not feasible, but boy, they sure seem worried about it. So that among other things, raises the larger point or difficulty here. So back in the 30s, when Churchill was assailing the disarmament talks, and he used to say, people think we will get peace through disarmament. He says, that's backwards. When we have peace, we will get disarmament. Reagan's formula, which he said to Gorbachev, was, we don't distrust each other because we're armed. We are armed because we distrust each other. So the question of trust comes along. So again, the paradox, I guess you might say here, is here's Reagan. We're going to share SDI technology with you. It is a crazy idea because any of the technology would have been transferable to other offensive weapons, right? Reagan didn't want to hear that. Okay. At the Reykjavik summit, at all the dramas about the arms deal that fell apart and the people saying, why couldn't he have made some compromise? I think you've probably picked this up because I noticed from your footnotes that you read the Soviet transcript, which is longer and better than the American State Department transcript. And in one of their meetings, they start arguing political philosophy. And it's almost comical. Gorbachev's complaining about, we show American movies in our theaters and you won't allow Soviet movies in your theaters. And I thought it had to take all of Reagan's discipline as a Hollywood man saying, are you kidding? Who wants to see a Soviet movie? That's what I would have thought, right? He didn't do that. He was a perfect gentleman. Yeah. But they're going on for a while, and Reagan says Lenin and, every Soviet leader has talked about world domination. And Gorbachev is frustrated, says to Schultz, Schultz, do we have to talk about this sort of thing again? And then Reagan pauses and he says, well, look, every Soviet leader has said that except you. You have not said it. This is where that first 4-hour speech Gorbachev gave in '85, that was all missing. The old boilerplate was missing from it. And most people said, oh, God, another long 4-hour Castro-esque speech from a Soviet leader. But Reagan and his people read it and said, this isn't the same as the previous. So Reagan says, maybe you don't believe it, but all the other leaders believe it. So where are we now? I wasn't in the room, obviously, none of us were. I thought that was the moment when Reagan is saying, we are this close to saying the Cold War is over and that we have a basis for trust to end it. Gorbachev didn't pick up on it. In fact, within just a few sentences, let's get back to the nuclear weapons we're trying to lower, right? Yeah. That whole passage is, and no one ever talks about that, because that goes on for 10 minutes. They're arguing about, you may remember the part, it's really comical. They argue about the two-party system. We have a two-party system. You have a one-party system. You control speech. And Gorbachev recites, I like to say, New York Times editorial page talking points back to him. But Reagan finally says to him, I'd like you to come to America and become a member of the Republican Party. Gorbachev, well, that's an interesting idea. He says, they're joshing each other, right? And where am I going with all this? There was one other part of that. They get sentimental. Again, it's the State Department transcripts of those meetings from our note takers were very spare and boring, and they don't capture any of this. You get sentimental when Gorbachev, I think it's Gorbachev that says, I can see us meeting 20 years from now, and I'll be very old, and you'll be very old, and I'll say, there's that Ronald Reagan guy, and boy, is he a tough customer to deal with. And we will have gotten rid of our nuclear weapons, and we can shake hands and talk about our grandkids. Yeah. There's never been a conversation like that at an American summit with a Soviet leader before, right? Is that, maybe in a paradoxical, the point I want to make is we like to say only Nixon could go to China. Only Reagan could end the Cold War, or could play that role at the ending of the Cold War. That's not to say you're wrong about to debunk triumphalism. I think the fact that we did not know what was going on is a very important, because we don't know what's going on now with, and we'll come back to this with Ukraine maybe. We've talked about this a little bit, right? We don't know what's going on now. So, but let me just say this. Sorry, that was a ramble. Your Reagan reversal gives one of the first and earliest accounts of the effect of the Able Archer exercises in alarming the Soviet Union, and then on the other end, the Reagan people realizing, things are bad. And we've learned more since then, but you have one of the earliest accounts of that. But I don't think that, my larger argument is I don't think it represents a reversal. It's just a change of tactics on Reagan's part. What's your latest revision of your revised opinion?
Well, like I said, now that we have more documents available, I think it's clear that Reagan came to office with this two-stage approach. First, you build up your military weapons, and then you use that power as leverage to get the Soviets to come to the negotiating table. Yeah. There was something else that I was just going to say. But go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that, like I say, people didn't believe Reagan when he said we want to get rid of nuclear weapons. People thought then he was being sincere about negotiations and reducing nuclear arms and the START talks and so forth. There is an interview he gives late in 1981 where he says, we have to reach some kind of settlement with the Soviet Union because the alternative is a war and that will end the world. Not many people talk that way. I mean, again, you have this in your books. The conventional view across the political spectrum is the Cold War's here forever, or at least another century. We just got to manage our way through it because no one thought this could. And here's Reagan saying, no, actually, this has to change. Wouldn't accept that. Wouldn't accept mutual sure destruction, some of the pillars of the strategy as it existed, right? So, I mean, I'll do a counterfactual. I don't like counterfactuals, but Gorbachev said a couple times, and maybe he was being polite and generous, but he said, I'm not sure what would have happened if Reagan hadn't been there. So, what if you'd had a there's two ways you could play this. What if Romanov had bested Gorbachev as Soviet leader? I think supposedly he was a hardliner and, another, I don't know. Or what if you'd had a conventional conservative Cold Warrior, say another Nixon? Would it have happened the same way? We can't really know, but I get a sense that Reagan accelerated things and made the breakthroughs that otherwise, who knows if they would have happened as they did.
Yeah,
In other words, you're not a determinist exactly, is kind of what I'm...
No, so as I said, I came to this studying Reagan because I was interested in how the Cold War ended. And what I was hoping was that I would be able to find lessons that, we can then apply to other global conflicts that can help us manage, at the very least, and resolve global conflicts. Where I'm at now, and I'm always doing more research, so my view may change, but where I'm at now is the Cold War ended because we had visionary leadership and engaged diplomacy on both sides at the same time. So both Gorbachev and Reagan wanted to abolish nuclear weapons. They wanted to end the arms race. I'm not sure that's replicable across other conflicts, right? It could have just been a lucky moment in time, which is not what I really want to conclude.
Right.
But we had two visionary leaders who were both committed to diplomacy at the same time in office. And both of them were willing to go against their own advisors in order to pursue nuclear
It's a really big point,
abolition.
right?
Yeah, and one of the things that I'm really being struck by in this more recent research that I'm doing is just how visionary Reagan's ideas were about security. I didn't appreciate that for a long time before a lot of these documents came out, just how visionary his ideas were about US security and how he stood alone, even within his own administration. He had very few supporters within his administration. Conservatives were constantly displeased with him and his talk about eliminating nuclear weapons, and SDI wasn't such a good idea. Sharing it was a terrible idea. Margaret Thatcher didn't like his ideas, members of Congress, so he really stood alone.
I remember the day after Reagan signed with Gorbachev in Washington the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, George Will's column the next day said, "Future historians will mark today as the day the West lost the Cold War." I got to ask George about that quote one time. It was a conference at Princeton, actually. I said, "So, George, what about it?" He was good. He said, he says, "Ronald Reagan turned out to know even more." He said, "I was wrong." Good for him to be. I was wrong, obviously. Ronald Reagan turned out to know even more than I thought he did. I thought, that's interesting. I think we're about to get the hook. I don't see the hook. And I always follow Ronald Reagan's line from show business, which is always leave your audience wanting more. I could go on for hours.
Yep.
But I think last point we want to try and raise, and you just hinted at it, is what are the lessons for today? There may not be a comparable Cold War type ideological struggle that arises out of World War II and all the rest of it. But I was very struck with your chapter on Afghanistan, where you said, I think accurately, but not troublingly really, but it sort of rankles against the triumphalist view, I'll put it that way, is that the Soviet Union blundered going into Afghanistan. You have some information there I didn't know about why they thought they needed to do it. And they realized it had been a mistake. They wanted to get out, and we made it hard for them to get out. We were an impediment to them getting out. And the parallel I see, I'm not even sure it's a parallel, but a similarity it reminds me of the current moment. Leave aside our own agony in Afghanistan in the last 20 years, but there was, as you know, and you describe in the book, big debates about what kind of weapons to supply the rebels in Afghanistan. And the big one was about Stinger missiles. And the worry was, that might provoke a more violent Soviet response. Who knows what that might lead to. We're worried about those weapons being out and about. So here we are in Ukraine, and we've seen the Biden administration go through what looks like a similar decision-making problem. We don't want to give them HIMARS missiles. Okay, we'll give them HIMARS missiles. No, we don't want to give M1 tanks. Okay, we'll give you M1 tanks. No, you don't need F-16s. Okay, we'll give you F-16s. And in the background, I know that we all know this from reading the papers, the calculation is the worry that this is going to provoke maybe even tactical nuclear weapons, as talked about, right? Maybe the current Russian leadership has similar views to the Soviet leadership described, but who knows? Different crew. And so you're looking at that saying, boy, And I have no idea none of us do, what's going on behind the scenes, whether there are some negotiations in Europe with the European leaders. Who the heck knows what, another thing. We learn later on things that we didn't know at the time, right? So that may be one area where people should reflect on our decision-making process then and how it worked and how it actually impeded. I don't know if we're impeding a settlement or not. I can't make sense of the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, with Afghanistan, the Soviets realized very quickly they had made a mistake by invading Afghanistan, and within a month of the invasion, they wanted to get out. And it took them a decade to find a face-saving way out of Afghanistan. Right? It was tragic, really. But as for Ukraine, as I'm reading these documents from the Soviet military, and they're saying that using nuclear weapons in Western Europe would be catastrophic for the Soviet Union and its allies, I can't help but think about Ukraine. The next time that Putin threatens to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, I mean, a lot of things have changed since the ending of the Cold War, but not geography and wind direction. So, but accidents happen. But I think one of the other lessons that I take away from this is we were so wrong on so many things about the Soviet Union. We didn't understand how their economy worked. We didn't understand. They talked about the military-industrial complex all the time. We never understood really what they were talking about. We didn't understand how it worked. We thought that they built up their arsenals in response to us. It was an employment scheme. Their factories built weapons, and then the Ministry of Defense was required to accept them. And so the factories just wanted to keep producing because that's how you keep the workers employed. And so when the Ministry of Defense would say, we do not want any more of these missiles, and they would push back, the factory owners would go to Defense Minister Ustinov and say, but comrade, how will we feed the workers if we're not producing missiles? And that accounted for a large part of their buildup.
Yeah, well, this is one of Reagan's insights, but puzzlements is, how can this possibly work? They can build all these missiles and tanks and fairly advanced weaponry, and they can't make cornflakes for their people.
Yeah, they had exploding TVs.
Right, and why did they, why was he wanted to use this in that famous speech in London in 1982. Why is the only cardiac clinic in Moscow on the 5th floor of a building that doesn't have an elevator? True story, right? And so something's wrong with this picture. That was, by the way, that was his insight. He had a prediction that we could just top him over like that, but that, wait a minute, there's something unnatural. He actually used the word, there's something unnatural about this form of rule that it can't possibly last. Because something that's against nature, ultimately nature returns, the old Horace line, right? That was an instinct of his. And again, one of the many things that set him apart. I don't know, I could go on a bit. I mean, I have Paul Letthouse here. There's I had a great question about Reagan's pacifism, about the very real doubts that he would have pushed the button if it came to it, right?
Well, Gorbachev said he wouldn't.
Yeah.
And he wouldn't even push it during training exercises.
Yeah. Yeah, right.
And
Reagan hated the training exercises, right? Yeah. Right. All right. Well, I
think we've reached our time.
Yeah, I think we have too. But thank you all very much. Beth, this has been fun.
Yes, exactly.
We must do it again.
Yeah.